Why should we be worried about what's happening half a planet away in Ukraine?
To me, it's very simple. There's no revived Soviet empire without Ukraine. Ukraine being reabsorbed by the Russians gives them the energy, gives them the agricultural base, expands the industrial base in a way that makes someone who is already a bad boy in the neighborhood a much more serious threat to world order. I would say it this way. I believe that not only are the people of Ukraine in imminent peril, I believe world order is in imminent peril. And the frustrating thing about the Europeans is they are so afraid of starting World War III that they will not take the necessary measures to prevent it from happening. To my mind, when I look at Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, all of them, I can't see a dime's bit of difference between them and the appeasers of the 1930s.
What is wrong with letting Russia annex a portion of Ukraine and then have its agreements made with Europe, and everyone is happy? The Ukrainian people under Russian rule may or may not be better off than they are now under Ukrainian rule.
I've never known a shark's appetite to be satisfied by eating one more swimmer. And I think it's easy for people to sit in the chancelleries of Western Europe or in the halls of academia in America and trade away other people's freedoms. The Ukrainian people don't want the Russians. Russia already is having to take measures to keep people from getting out of Crimea because they learned this with East Berlin 50 years ago. The only way they could maintain that empire was to build fences high enough that folks couldn't get out. Well, if it's so great, why do we need fences to keep people from getting out?
I see. The propaganda machine that Russia has in place now seems to be working very well. I mean, they call it their truth. Do you see any hope for the Russian people in hearing any other information on what is happening from other sources other than Moscow?
Well, they're not going to get information from many other sources at the present time. The best hope for the Russian people is a stable, democratic, prosperous Ukraine. In the 1960s and 70s, people of Ukraine and Russia and the satellite states would listen to Radio Free Europe, and they would hear about what was happening in the West. I can't tell you, Walter, how many people I've spoken to over the last 15 years that I've worked in Ukraine who would gather around little radio sets in places like Lviv and Rivne, Chernihiv, Donetsk, and they would listen to that radio. Why did they do that? Why did they risk the neighbor in the next apartment turning them in, or maybe even a member of their own family turning them in? Because even then they knew there was no hope in the Soviet system. They had a long memory. They knew what Stalin had done to them in the 30s. They knew what he did to them again in the 1940s. And you and I both know that the Soviets retaking Ukraine wreaked as much havoc and as much devastation in the country as the Germans did in 41. Those people knew what had happened to them. And so there's not going to be a lot of hope for the Russian people if the light of freedom and opportunity goes out of Ukraine.
What can the U.S. really do, though, to help the situation there? And what do you feel that your project can do to assist the situation in Ukraine?
Well, first and foremost, the United States needs to provide Ukraine with defensive weapons. And we're not talking about tanks. We're not talking about offensive weapons that are going to let them take territory. But we simply need to give them the means to defend themselves so that the Russians can't steal any more territory. Now, our project is a little bit different. Our project recognizes the fact that 5 million people have been affected by this conflict. Almost 2 million of them have been rendered homeless. They have been driven from their homes by this war. 1.7 million children have been affected. About half of those are suffering from post-traumatic stress issues. we're looking at a humanitarian catastrophe. And in a few weeks, when Putin starts again, and he will, whether it's in Mariupol in the south or whether it's in Slaviansk in the north, when they start again, there aren't going to be 2 million refugees. We could see 3 million or 4 million. Well, we're talking about a country whose resources are stretched to the limits. Families have taken people into their homes. The Ukrainian diaspora has given millions of dollars. When we get to next year, we're not going to have a few hundred people die of exposure or hunger. We're going to see tens of thousands of people die if somebody doesn't do something.